The soundtrack of the original Resident Evil to me is special in the sense that it's a horror game soundtrack that achieves the rare accomplishment of being cinematic and atmospheric while at the same time also being memorable. It seems like it's so often that a horror game OST can creep you out and be very atmospheric. They'll elevate the mood, but to me it seems like it's very rare, especially now, that any of the tracks really stick with you after you turn the game off. But Resident Evil had so many earworms. You got the save room music, the guardhouse basement, Rebecca's theme, Barry's Revenge. You got the end theme Still Dawn, which is probably one of my favorite video game songs of all time. And then you got the Resident Evil Director's Cut DualShock Edition soundtrack. That soundtrack is also special, but for very different reasons. You gotta wonder, why is this song that sounds like Little Sneezer's fart trumpet from Tiny Toons? Why does this exist when Resident Evil already had a perfectly good soundtrack? And how does it tie into perhaps the biggest hoax in the history of the Japanese music industry? Well, for this video, let's talk about the Japanese composer that got caught faking being deaf. This video is sponsored by Scentbird. Lately I've been getting more into fragrances. My favorites at the moment all seem to have notes of lavender and vanilla, but it can be hard and expensive at first to figure out what you like in a fragrance. Scentbird has reimagined the experience of buying fragrances in a way that helps you discover your own personal style. Scentbird lets you choose a new designer fragrance to try every month for just $17. Every month you get to pick what you want to receive, so there's no surprises. They have perfumes and colognes and lots of unisex options, and with each fragrance, you get a 30-day supply, so you can try out fragrances before committing to a full bottle, which can sometimes range from $150 all the way to $500. You discover new fragrances by taking a simple quiz on Scentbird, based on your preferences, previous purchases, and quiz answers to help you find a fragrance you'll love. Make sure to use my coupon code WANG for 55% off at Scentbird. It's just a little over $7 for your first month. And it's available in the US and Canada. This month they send me, and they give you these cards with the information about the fragrances. They sent me Versace Dylan Blue, they sent me Burberry Brit for Men, Dolce & Gabbana The One, Michael Germain Sexual Noir, and Prada Luna Rosa, which was my favorite one of them, and sure enough, it's got that top note of lavender. Thanks Scentbird for sponsoring this video. Check out the links in the description below. So I was thinking about that Hudson Mohawk song from Reddit. You know, that really annoying song, there's that thing where the Redditor put it on his sex playlist. You know, that really annoying song that sounds like a seagull getting beaten to death in front of crying children by an elderly Englishman for stealing his chips.
Why, you little... I touch you! Go!
Stop! He's already dead.
I can't play the song because of copyright, but it's the one that goes like, heh, 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 heh. I don't know why I did it like Peter Griffin, but you get the point, you know the song. This guy puts it on his sex playlist, then he finds that his girlfriend hates it, and it winds up ruining the relationship. I don't want to do a video about that topic because it just got played out so fast, but it did remind me of another song. That song being the Mansion Basement song from the second re-release of Resident Evil Director's Cut DualShock Edition. Now that's the song that belongs on your sex playlist. Composed by Mamoru Samuragochi, a deaf composer, this soundtrack only really exists because Capcom was a bit light on bonus content for the third release of the game. The main control was the brand new controller vibrations, but that's really not enough to sell a game for the third time. You need a little bit more than that. But they'd pretty much shot their load on the first director's cut, so have a brand new soundtrack, I guess. So let's take a look at the soundtrack. I mean, you got the classic Mansion Basement song that everybody knows. The one that sounds like it's performed on an instrument made entirely of tuned butt cheeks farting. So you're telling me this song was written by a deaf composer? No way. You gotta be kidding me. I had a friend when I was a kid who, for unknown reasons, would always kinda like go like this. I don't know what this was. Whenever I hear that song, I think of that motion, and it's probably, if that motion made a sound, that song is the sound it would make. But the crappiness of this song has gone on to outshine a lot of the other fantastic turds that await you on this soundtrack. For example, you've got Barry's Conversation, which sounds like Twinkle Twinkle Little Star. You got Wesker is Found, which sounds less like a song for a shady double-crosser and more like the theme for a mischievous kitty cat. And then you got the theme for the Black Tiger boss battle, which it sounds like the circus came to town, and then the elephants got loose and trampled everybody to death. But that's not to say that the score is entirely without good tracks. You have one track that I think actually kind of beats its counterpart in the original, that one being Disappearance. This one to me sounds a lot more dark and foreboding, and makes me think of something that might have been on the Sweet Home soundtrack. You've got the Second Floor Mansion Revisited, which sounds like something that could have been on the Parasite Eve soundtrack. And then there's Rebecca's Safe in the Medical Room, which is probably my favorite track on this soundtrack. It reminds me a lot of something that you'd hear in a Fulci movie. In fact, it reminds me very specifically of certain songs from Manhattan Baby and The Beyond. The difference in quality between some of these tracks is so striking, it's almost as if two different people wrote it. But regardless of the quality of the soundtrack, its existence is a bit of an anomaly, as is its composer Mamoru Samuragochi, who with his hair sweep, shades, and baggy shirts, looks like a character that walked out of a Yakuza game. He looks like Hiroshi Tanahashi in a disguise living a double life. So let's take a look into this guy's story. Samuragochi was born in 1963 in Hiroshima to a couple of atomic bomb survivors. He was musically inclined from a very young age, creating compositions on a toy marimba that his parents had gotten him at 5 years old, and continued to compose throughout his childhood. According to a biography written about him by his record label Nippon Columbia, he was playing Beethoven and Bach by the age of 10, and through junior high and high school he taught himself music theory, harmony, counterpoint, instrumentation, and orchestration, and he declined to go to music school. He felt that it would have been a waste of his time. You see, he disliked modern classical music because he felt that, ironically, it was too atonal. He would instead continue to pursue his passion of making music as an adult by studying the work of Western classical composers. But then, tragedy strikes. He begins to suffer from severe migraine headaches that affect his hearing. And at the age of 24, he's diagnosed with a hearing disability with severe hearing loss in both ears. But despite this hurdle, not only does he keep pushing forward, but he demands to do things on his own terms. He's offered work composing for TV dramas, but he hated TV dramas. He turned them down because he felt these shows were garbage and he could do better. So instead, he worked at a video store and as a street sweeper, doing what he could to make money until he got a composition job that was up to his standards. That would come in 1997 with a film called Remembering the Cosmos Flower, a movie about a schoolgirl who gets AIDS from a blood transfusion. And then not long after, his second job would come, that being the infamous Resident Evil Director's Cut DualShock soundtrack. And regardless of how that soundtrack was received, Capcom would hire him again not long after, this time for Onimusha Warlords. But tragedy strikes once again. While working on the soundtrack with only 3 songs left to compose, Mamoru suffers from a seizure that causes him to lose almost all of what was left of his hearing. But using his perfect pitch, as well as subtitled scenes of dialogue from the game, he powers through and completes the soundtrack. And this soundtrack is like night and day from the Resident Evil DualShock soundtrack. It's fully orchestrated, completely competent, and basically what you would expect from a samurai video game. In particular, the track Rising Sun became very popular. And it was this soundtrack that propels him to a whole new level of prestige. With Time magazine dubbing him the Beethoven of Japan, they wrote an article that tells his story, as well as where he's at after having created the Onimusha soundtrack. Today, Samuragochi works in a tiny, dark room in his Yokohama apartment. The saddest thing for me is not to be able to hear an orchestra perform my work, he says. But then I think, I am composing not for myself, but to make other people happy. As he turns up the volume on an MD player for a visitor, tears fill his eyes as he strains to hear the rhythmic beat of the taiko drums. Percussive noises are the only ones he can detect anymore. Curiously, Samuragochi believes his hearing loss has made him a better composer. "I am not distracted," he says. "I listen to myself. If you trust your inner sense of sound, you create something that is truer. It is like communicating from the heart. Losing my hearing was a gift from God." I mean, if going completely deaf is the difference between the Resident Evil DualShock soundtrack and the Onimusha Warlord soundtrack, he's probably right. But it was his next major work that would propel him from being a guy who's known for making good video game soundtracks to a national hero. After becoming fully deaf, he discarded all 12 of the symphonies he had previously composed. And it's at this time that he begins teaching piano at a school for disabled children. Inspired by one of his students, he begins work on a new symphony, Symphony No. 1, Hiroshima, a tribute to the victims of the bombing. And as a second-generation Hiroshima survivor, he was uniquely qualified to make this tribute. Completed in 2003, it was first performed in 2008 when G8 leaders would visit Hiroshima to reflect upon what had happened there. But it gained greater significance in the years following. It's 2011. Nippon Columbia is gearing up for their 100th anniversary celebration. This would include several releases, one of which being Symphony No. 1 Hiroshima. Then on March 11th, 2011, the most powerful earthquake ever recorded in Japan hits, leading to the Fukushima nuclear disaster. This event makes the tribute to Hiroshima even more poignant. Samuragochi comments, "The nuclear plant crisis has revived before our eyes the horrors of radiation that may have been forgotten in Japan, the only country to have been attacked with nuclear weapons," he said. "Now, it is high time that people in the world once again look at Hiroshima." The symphony would be released on CD that summer, and it would sell 180,000 copies. That might not sound like a lot for a pop artist, but for a classical musician, that's basically unheard of. In classical music, if you sell a couple thousand copies, you're lucky. So at this point, Samuragochi is a bona fide sensation. And in the wake of this release, he has a documentary film crew following him around as he meets with victims of the disaster. The documentary, Melody and Soul, the composer who lost his hearing, would be released in 2013, and this would mark the peak of his fame. It would also mark the point in which everything began to crumble. June of 2013, Samuragochi is interviewed by a reporter from the magazine Era. This interview is never published because of two things that the reporter witnessed. The first thing was that Samuragochi would respond to the reporter's questions before the sign language interpreter was finished with their movements. And the other thing happened at the end of the interview. The taxi to bring the reporter back shows up. The driver rings the intercom. As soon as the intercom rings, Samuragochi reacts. He stands up immediately and says, "I'm here." How did the deaf composer that's famously very deaf hear the intercom? So being suspicious of the legitimacy of the entire story, the reporter opts to not publish the interview. Instead, the magazine publishes an article entitled, "The Lies of Samuragochi Seen Through by This Magazine." But at the time, that article didn't amount to much, and Samuragochi's music was still being performed by orchestras around Japan. But it was during one of these performances that a composer named Takeo Noguchi noticed something else. This song, Symphony No. 1 Hiroshima, had plagiarized a bunch of other songs. Most flagrantly, work by Gustav Mahler. Noguchi wrote an article exposing this, but no music publications were willing to accept the article. You see, they were all sponsored by Samuragochi's label. So instead, it winds up being published by a news publication, Shincho 45, in November of 2013. But once again, at this time, it doesn't really amount to much. And now we're headed to 2014, the Winter Olympics in Sochi. Daisuke Takahashi, a figure skater representing Japan, was set to perform to one of Samuragochi's tracks, Sonatina for Violin, a composition that he had dedicated to a young violinist with a prosthetic arm named Miko Okubo. But then, seemingly out of nowhere, on February 5th, 2 days before the start of the Olympics, Samuragochi drops a bomb. Through his lawyer, Samuragochi had contacted NHK, the company that broadcast his documentary. In his correspondence, Samuragochi admits that since 1996, when working on his first movie soundtrack, Remembering the Cosmos Flower, he had been hiring a person to compose music for him. "I had to ask the person to help me for more than half the work, because the ear condition got worse." He offered an apology, and NHK apologized for ever having broadcast his documentary. However, at the time, he did not reveal the identity of the man who was secretly writing his music. But the next day, the man would reveal himself. Takashi Nigaki, a professor at the Toho Gakuen School of Music. At a press conference, he would give a rundown of their history together. It begins in 1996. Samuragochi had been looking for a composer's assistant, and Nigaki was the man who got the job. His first task? He's given a tape with a short theme for the movie, and is asked to turn it into an orchestral piece. He noted that it's pretty common for composers to have assistants that'll help compose parts for different songs. But as the relationship continues, he demands more and more of him, where he's basically just making the whole thing. He'd give him descriptions of what he wants, with explanations like pursuit of abstract beauty in medieval religious music, rising music, musical harmony between dissonance and function adjustment, 4 themes, prayer, revelation, suffering, and chaos. And for a long time, Nigaki went along with it. Having only made the equivalent of about 70,000 bucks over the course of 18 years, Nigaki explained that he didn't really care about the money. He was just excited to have work he made heard by people, even if they didn't know it was by him. But throughout the years, Nigaki had become increasingly worried about the relationship, especially after the various expose articles that were written. He wanted out, but he claimed that Samuragochi threatened to kill himself if he stopped writing for him. Not knowing what to do at this point, Nigaki meets with that young violin player, Miku Okubo, and her family. He apologizes personally to them, but then he realizes that just wasn't enough, especially with the Olympics coming. You had this figure skater representing the country to the entire world about to skate to that song. It would be an even bigger disgrace for it to get exposed at that level, with these ramifications. So he knew that he had to publicly confess. He goes on to say that not only could Samuragochi not compose music at all, but he was faking his deafness entirely. At first, he'd pretend to need sign language or lip reading, but as he'd get more engaged with the conversation, he'd drop the act. And eventually, when they'd meet, he just wouldn't even bother to pretend at all. The following week, in a handwritten letter, Samuragochi would claim that he was in fact deaf, but some of his hearing had returned over the course of the previous 3 years. He apologizes once again and goes on to hide from the public eye. And during this time, the story of how the Japanese Beethoven was a big fraud circulates all over the world. Capcom expresses their shock, as does his record label. And young Miku Okubo writes a letter stating that she's disgusted with him and adults in general, and she's going to give up playing the violin. Then a month later, Samuragochi finally emerges at a press conference of his own. He's clean shaven with short hair and no shades, just completely stripped of his formerly flamboyant persona. At the 2-hour-long press conference, he apologizes once again. He clarifies that although he did lie about the extent of his deafness, he does suffer from hearing loss. Just not enough to qualify for the legal definition of deafness, prompting him to return his certificate of level 2 physical disability. But he also said that Nigaki lied, that he was always asking for more money, that he exaggerated the degree to which Samuragochi was faking his deafness, and that he made up the suicide threats. And in response, he stated his intention to sue Nigaki for defamation, although no such lawsuit appears to have ever materialized. So what happens next? Nigaki, after spending nearly 2 decades in the shadows, gets to experience somewhat of a redemption arc. Later that month, he would perform live with Miku, who had in fact not given up violin. And 2 years later, in August of 2016, the first symphony written under his own name after the scandal was performed, Symphony No. 2, Litany. He would also return to the game industry in 2019, composing the theme song for the game Earth Defense Force Iron Rain. As for Samuragochi, you might be surprised that he's returned, somewhat recently actually. In October of 2020, a musical narrative series called Malleus Maleficarum appeared on YouTube. Although the music was at first uncredited, it would be revealed in February of 2021 that the music was in fact composed by Samuragochi. The producer of this product is Mr. Yasuyuki Hari, former chief producer of Fuji TV's documentary program The Nonfiction, who has worked on various works at the video production company However. Mr. Hari had the impression that Samuragochi was very soft-spoken and said, "I felt his passion for songwriting so strongly that I wanted to help him in my own way. I got involved." With photos of his new studio setup, Samuragochi expressed his gratitude for being able to produce music for the series. And when you listen to it, it doesn't sound like it was written by a guy with zero idea how to compose music. A long time has passed, who knows if he's up to his old tricks or not. But maybe he's not. I mean, there is something interesting to note. Although at this point, Samuragochi's name has been essentially wiped from everything he'd ever done previously, there's something that Nigaki said in his press conference that's often glossed over. During this press conference, he had stated that he had produced over 20 songs for Samuragochi. But the Resident Evil DualShock soundtrack has over 60 tracks alone. Onimusha Warlords over 40, which means unless he had other assistants, he most likely produced some of these songs on his own. That would explain so much. But anyway, that's the story of the composer who faked being deaf. If you like this video, check out my video about the couple who were supposed to lose their virginity on livestream in the 90s. And again, thanks to Scentbird. Don't forget to click the links in the description and use code WANG.